The year is 1932, and in the city of Kharkiv, capital of Soviet Ukraine at the time, a woman named Maria Petrovna stands in a queue that stretches around an entire city block. She has been waiting for 4 hours, and she will wait another 3 before reaching the counter of a state-run bread shop. When her turn finally comes, the clerk will inform her that the daily allocation has been exhausted. She will return home empty-handed, her ration card still clutched in her frost-bitten fingers, worthless for that day. This scene, repeated millions of times across the Soviet Union throughout its 7-decade existence, represents not merely an inconvenience, but the fundamental reality of how Soviet citizens obtained the most basic necessity of human survival: food. Understanding the Soviet diet requires understanding that food in the USSR was never simply about nutrition or culture or preference. Food was politics. Food was ideology. Food was a weapon, a reward, a punishment, and above all, a mechanism of state control more powerful than any secret police apparatus. From the moment the Bolsheviks seized power in October 1917 until the final collapse of the Soviet system in December 1991, what Soviet citizens ate, how much they ate, and whether they ate at all was determined not by market forces, personal choice, or agricultural reality, but by central planning, political loyalty, and the whims of a command economy that treated human beings as inputs in a grand industrial equation. The story begins in the chaos of the Russian Civil War, when Vladimir Lenin's new Bolshevik government faced immediate catastrophe. The policy known as war communism, implemented between 1918 and 1921, included forced grain requisitioning that stripped peasants of their harvests at gunpoint. Armed detachments of workers and Red Army soldiers swept through villages, confiscating not just surplus grain, but often the seed stock needed for the next planting season. The result was predictable and catastrophic. The famine of 1921 to 1922 killed an estimated 5 million people. In the Volga region, reports documented cases of cannibalism, of parents consuming their own children, of entire villages reduced to corpses and the nearly dead. American Relief Administration, led by Herbert Hoover, eventually provided aid that saved millions more. But the pattern had been established. Soviet agricultural policy would prioritize ideological goals over human survival. Lenin's temporary retreat into the new economic policy in 1921 allowed limited private trade and gave peasants some control over their production. For a brief period, the Soviet diet actually improved. Markets reopened. Peasants could sell surplus. The specter of mass starvation receded. But this was always intended as a tactical withdrawal, not a permanent settlement. When Joseph Stalin consolidated power in the late 1920s, he viewed the NEP as an ideological compromise that had to be eliminated. His solution was collectivization, and its impact on the Soviet diet would be measured in millions of corpses. Beginning in 1929, Stalin ordered the forced collectivization of agriculture. Individual peasant farms were to be abolished and replaced with collective farms, or kolkhozes, where land, livestock, and equipment would be pooled under state control. Wealthier peasants, labeled kulaks, were to be liquidated as a class. In practice, this meant that anyone who resisted collectivization could be branded a kulak, regardless of actual wealth. Between 1930 and 1932, approximately 1.8 million people were deported to special settlements in Siberia and Kazakhstan. Hundreds of thousands died in transit or shortly after arrival. The peasants who remained often slaughtered their livestock rather than surrender it to the collective farms. Between 1929 and 1933, the Soviet Union lost approximately half its horses, 45% of its cattle, and 2/3 of its sheep and goats. This was not just a loss of meat. Horses were the primary source of agricultural power. Without horses, plowing became nearly impossible. It's an artery. The collective farms, meanwhile, were managed by party loyalists with no agricultural experience, operating under production quotas set by bureaucrats in Moscow who had never worked a field in their lives. The result was the Holodomor, the terror famine of 1932 to 1933, which killed between 3.5 and 5 million people in Ukraine alone, with millions more dying across the Soviet Union, particularly in Kazakhstan and the North Caucasus. The Soviet state continued to export grain even as its citizens starved. In 1932, the USSR exported 1.7 million tons of grain. Stalin needed the hard currency from grain exports to purchase industrial equipment from the West for his 5-year plans. The industrialization of the Soviet Union was quite literally built on the stolen calories of millions of peasants. In the Ukrainian countryside, activists went house to house searching for hidden grain. They used metal rods to probe the earth for buried food. They confiscated not just grain but potatoes, beets, even dried fish. A law passed in August 1932 made theft of socialist property, including gleaning leftover grain from fields, punishable by death or 10 years in the Gulag. Children were shot for picking wheat. The famine was not a natural disaster or an unforeseen consequence. It was the result of specific policy decisions made by identifiable individuals who continued those policies even as reports of mass death reached Moscow. Those who survived the famine entered a Soviet food system that would define daily life for the next 6 decades. The foundation of this system was rationing, which had been introduced during the Civil War, briefly suspended during the NEP, and then reintroduced in 1929. Rationing would continue in various forms until it was officially abolished in December 1947, though in practice, shortages and informal rationing persisted until the very end of the Soviet Union. The ration card system divided Soviet citizens into categories based on their usefulness to the state. Workers in heavy industry received the highest rations. Office workers received less. Dependents, including children, and the elderly who did not work, received the least. This hierarchy was not incidental. It was the physical manifestation of Soviet ideology which held that value was determined by contribution to socialist construction. If you worked in a factory producing tanks or steel, you deserved to eat. If you were merely a pensioner or a child, your caloric needs were secondary. The typical rations varied enormously by time period, location, and category, but some examples illustrate the reality. In Moscow, in 1942, during the worst period of World War II, a worker in a priority industry might receive 900 grams of bread per day, while a dependent received just 300 grams. A dependent's monthly ration might include 400 grams of meat, 400 grams of fats, and 1 kilogram of sugar. These were the official allocations. Actual availability was often far less. The Second World War brought catastrophe to the Soviet food system on a scale that dwarfed even collectivization. Nazi Germany's invasion in June 1941 resulted in the occupation of the Soviet Union's most productive agricultural regions. Ukraine, the Kuban, and the Western territories that produced much of the USSR's grain fell under German control. The siege of Leningrad, which lasted from September 1941 to January 1944, resulted in the deaths of an estimated 800,000 civilians, most from starvation. During the worst months of the siege, the daily bread ration for dependents fell to 125 grams, a piece roughly the size of a deck of cards, made from a mixture that included sawdust and cellulose. People ate wallpaper paste, boiled leather, and hunted rats and cats. Cases of cannibalism were documented by the NKVD, with more than 2,000 arrests for the crime during the siege. The war killed an estimated 27 million Soviet citizens, and its impact on agriculture was devastating. The collective farms had already been stripped of their most productive workers, who were conscripted into the Red Army. Women, children, and the elderly were left to work the fields with minimal equipment. The Germans systematically destroyed infrastructure, killed livestock, and burned crops. The famine of 1946 to 1947, caused by drought combined with the war's aftermath, killed an additional 1 to 1.5 million people. Rationing, which Stalin had hoped to abolish as a symbol of post-war recovery, had to continue. When rationing was finally eliminated in December 1947, it was replaced not with abundance, but with a different system of shortage management. The Soviet diet in the post-war Stalin years was characterized by chronic scarcity of everything except bread and potatoes. The average Soviet citizen in the early 1950s consumed approximately 2,800 calories per day, which was adequate for survival, but monotonous and nutritionally unbalanced. Bread and potatoes constituted the bulk of caloric intake. Meat, when available, was often of poor quality. Fresh fruits and vegetables were seasonal luxuries. The state-run food distribution system operated through a network of stores that were nominally open to all citizens, but in practice, highly stratified. Closed distribution centers existed for the party elite, military officers, scientists, and other favored groups. These special stores, known as zakryti raspredeliteli, offered goods unavailable to ordinary citizens: fresh meat, butter, imported coffee, chocolate, caviar. The existence of these parallel distribution systems was an open secret that contradicted every principle of socialist equality the Soviet state claimed to embody. A factory worker in Magnitogorsk and a Central Committee member in Moscow lived in different nutritional universes, though both were ostensibly equal citizens of the same socialist paradise. After Stalin's death in March 1953, Nikita Khrushchev promised improvements in living standards, including food. His Virgin Lands campaign, launched in 1954, aimed to bring millions of hectares of previously uncultivated land in Kazakhstan and Siberia under the plow. Initially, the campaign produced impressive results. Grain production increased substantially in the mid-1950s. But the Virgin Lands were marginal territory, prone to drought and soil erosion. By the early 1960s, yields were declining, and dust storms were turning vast areas into wasteland. Khrushchev's other major agricultural initiative was his obsession with corn. Inspired by visits to American farms, he became convinced that corn was a miracle crop that would solve the Soviet Union's chronic meat shortage by providing abundant animal feed. He ordered corn planted across the Soviet Union, including regions where the climate was completely unsuitable. The corn campaign was a spectacular failure. Much of the crop never matured. Resources were diverted from proven crops like wheat and rye. Agricultural output stagnated, and by the early 1960s, the Soviet Union was forced to begin importing grain from the West, a humiliating admission of failure that would continue until the system's collapse. The Khrushchev years did see some genuine improvements in the Soviet diet. Meat consumption increased from 26 kilograms per person per year in 1950 to 41 kilograms in 1964. Dairy products became more available, but these gains were modest and uneven. The fundamental problems of the Soviet agricultural system remained. Collective farms operated under irrational production quotas, managers falsified reports to meet targets, investment in infrastructure and equipment was inadequate, and the lack of market mechanisms meant there was no connection between what was produced and what consumers actually wanted. The Brezhnev era, from 1964 to 1982, represented the peak of Soviet food consumption, but also the entrenchment of the system's fundamental contradictions. Leonid Brezhnev, unlike Khrushchev, was not an agricultural reformer. His approach was to throw resources at the problem while avoiding structural changes that might threaten party control. The Soviet Union invested enormous sums in agriculture, which by the 1970s consumed approximately 1/4 of total state investment. The results were dismal. Agricultural productivity remained far below Western levels. Waste was staggering. Estimates suggest that between 20 and 30% of the harvest was lost between field and table due to inadequate storage, transportation, and processing facilities. By the 1970s, the Soviet Union had become the world's largest importer of grain, purchasing millions of tons annually from the United States, Canada, and Argentina. This dependency on capitalist agriculture to feed a socialist state was an absurdity that Soviet propagandists struggled to explain. The official line was that grain imports allowed the USSR to divert domestic production to animal feed, thereby increasing meat consumption. There was some truth to this. Meat consumption did reach 70 kilograms per person per year by the early 1980s, but the quality remained poor, and availability was sporadic. The daily experience of obtaining food in the Brezhnev years was defined by the queue and the Blatt network. The queue was a Soviet institution, a fact of life that consumed hours of every citizen's time. People queued for everything: bread, milk, meat, vegetables, shoes, soap. The queue was where you learned patience, where you developed strategies for cutting in line or holding places for friends, where you heard rumors about which stores might have received shipments of scarce goods. The queue was also where the fundamental injustice of the Soviet system was most visible. While ordinary citizens waited for hours to buy tough, gristly meat, the party elite shopped in their special stores, their tables laden with delicacies. Blatt, the system of informal connections and reciprocal favors, was essential for obtaining anything beyond the basics. If you worked in a grocery store, you had access to goods before they reached the shelves. If your cousin worked in a meat processing plant, you might obtain better cuts. If you knew someone who knew someone with access to imported goods, you might trade favors to obtain coffee or chocolate. Blatt was technically illegal, a form of corruption, but it was so universal that the system could not function without it. The command economy created shortages, and Blatt was the shadow economy that made life bearable. The typical Soviet diet in the Brezhnev years was heavy on starches and light on variety. Breakfast might be kasha, a porridge made from buckwheat or other grains, with tea. Lunch, the main meal, often eaten at workplace cafeterias, might include borscht or shchi, cabbage soup, followed by a main course of potatoes with a small portion of meat or fish, and kompot, a drink made from boiled fruit. Dinner was often lighter, perhaps bread with sausage or cheese. Fresh vegetables were available mainly in summer and early fall. Bananas, oranges, and other tropical fruits were rare luxuries. Coffee was scarce and expensive. Most people drank tea. Certain foods became iconic of Soviet life precisely because they were ubiquitous and standardized. Soviet sausage, kolbasa, was a staple, though its quality varied wildly, and jokes about its mysterious ingredients were universal. Black bread, dense and sour, was everywhere. Mayonnaise was beloved and used liberally. Canned goods, particularly sprats in oil and condensed milk, were pantry staples. The Soviet food industry produced standardized products according to GOST standards, state specifications that theoretically ensured quality, but in practice often resulted in mediocrity. The system's inefficiency was staggering. The Soviet Union had more agricultural workers than the United States, but produced less food. A Soviet farmer in the 1980s produced enough to feed about 8 people. An American farmer fed about 80. The problem was not the land or the climate or the work ethic of Soviet citizens. The problem was the system itself. Collective farm workers had no incentive to maximize production because they did not benefit from higher yields. The small private plots that collective farmers were allowed to maintain, typically about half a hectare, produced a disproportionate share of the USSR's vegetables, fruits, and animal products. These private plots occupied about 3% of agricultural land, but produced roughly a quarter of total output. This fact alone demonstrated the superiority of individual incentive over collective organization, but acknowledging it would have undermined the entire ideological foundation of the Soviet state. By the time Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in March 1985, the Soviet food system was in crisis. His initial response was an anti-alcohol campaign, launched in May 1985, which restricted the sale of vodka and other spirits. The campaign was intended to improve public health and labor productivity, but it had the perverse effect of reducing state revenues from alcohol sales, which had been a major source of income. It also drove drinking underground and increased the production of samagon, homemade moonshine, which was often dangerous. Gorbachev's broader reforms, glasnost and perestroika, exposed the depths of the Soviet system's failures. As censorship loosened, Soviet citizens could finally discuss openly what they had always known privately. The system did not work. Newspapers published articles about food shortages, about the waste and corruption in the agricultural sector, about the special privileges of the elite. Television showed images of empty store shelves. The gap between official propaganda, which still claimed the superiority of socialism, and lived reality became impossible to ignore. The final years of the Soviet Union saw the food situation deteriorate rapidly. In 1990 and 1991, shortages became acute. Rationing was reintroduced in many cities. Queues grew longer. Store shelves were often completely empty. The Soviet state, which had always claimed legitimacy based on its ability to provide for its citizens' material needs, could no longer perform that basic function. In Moscow, in 1991, it was common to find stores with nothing for sale except vinegar and pickles. Bread lines stretched for blocks. People hoarded whatever they could find. The August 1991 coup attempt and the subsequent collapse of the Soviet Union in December were driven by many factors, but the failure of the food system was among the most fundamental. A state that cannot feed its people cannot survive, regardless of its military power or ideological claims. When Boris Yeltsin stood on a tank outside the Russian White House and defied the coup plotters, he was defending not just political freedom, but the possibility of a life where obtaining food did not require hours of queuing, where store shelves might actually contain goods, where individual effort might be rewarded. The transition to a market economy in the 1990s brought its own hardships. Prices soared. Many people, especially pensioners on fixed incomes, struggled to afford food. But the queues disappeared. Stores filled with goods, including imported products Soviet citizens had only dreamed of. The variety and availability of food in post-Soviet Russia bore no resemblance to the Soviet era. By the early 2000s, the average Russian had access to a diet that would have been unimaginable to their Soviet-era counterparts. The Soviet diet was not simply a matter of cuisine or nutrition. It was the physical manifestation of a system that subordinated individual needs to state priorities, that treated food as a tool of control, and that ultimately failed to provide even the most basic level of material security its ideology promised. From the famines of the early years through the chronic shortages of the later decades, the Soviet experience with food demonstrates that no amount of ideological commitment can overcome the fundamental problems of central planning and the elimination of market mechanisms. The millions who died in Soviet famines, the millions more who spent countless hours queuing for basic necessities, the generations who grew up never tasting a banana or drinking real coffee. These are the human costs of an economic system that ignored human nature and economic reality in pursuit of an ideological vision. The empty store shelves of 1991 were not a temporary aberration, but the inevitable endpoint of a system that had been failing its citizens from the very beginning. A system where food was never about feeding people, but about maintaining power. And where the most basic human need became the most powerful argument for the system's ultimate collapse.